Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and I am Chris Weuve, and this is Starfleet Tactical. As you can see, I've made progress in my office, but it's still a disaster zone. And part of that being kind of a disaster zone means that I don't actually have a prepared presentation for tonight. So we're going to do a question and answer show because we talked about a bunch of stuff. So think about what your questions are. Think about anything you want me to go over and touch on again. Otherwise, I will just sort of wander around and talk about a few things. I've got a couple of things that I could talk about a little bit, I suppose. Certainly I'm going to talk about the schedule. In fact, let me go ahead and talk about the schedule right now. Chris Carlson says hi, by the way. I asked him if he wanted to come on and we could talk together, and he's busy tonight, and Pat's busy, so you've got just me tonight. This is what the schedule looks like. So it's the 23rd of August, 23rd of August today. I suppose I could have deleted that because yes, we are having a show. We're going to have one next week. Not sure about the 6th of September because friends of mine are going to be close enough that I could drive and go visit them and have dinner with them. And so people I don't see very often, so I think I may do that. 13th of September should be a yes. The 20th of September, I'm going to be at Capclave, which is a science fiction convention in the DC area. I'm not doing any presentations. I'm just attending because friends of mine are going to be there. And frankly, I don't do as many presentations at cons as I used to, in part because I have a show on YouTube and I can do presentations all day long on or at least, for an hour or so once a week. And so I don't feel like I need to scratch the itch at cons as much as I used to. So, but then I'm expecting to be here on the 27th and the 4th of October. And I forgot to change the color for the 11th of October. That should be red because that is definitely a no. My niece is getting married on that day. And so I will be in Iowa, unavailable to do a show. So that's what the schedule looks like for the near future. And then, going back or going down below and taking a look at all the things that I've got planned. As we've been going down this journey, with the last time I talked about aircraft carriers and how they work, and why aircraft carriers versus battleships. Chris and I had a long conversation about that. And so I intend to sort of build upon that and some of the stuff I've done with Battlestar Galactica, et cetera. So I'm revising my aircraft carriers in space talk. I've expanded it to 2 hours, but basically I'm going to sort of do a revamping of it. And I'm going to have the 1 hour version, the 2 hour version, and the 3 hour version. And so I will probably do that for the show. I want to do a deep dive on the Akira class Federation starship. Because actually there's a chance that I'm going to be involved in a role-playing game where we're going to be on the Akira. And so as the tactical officer for the Akira, I've done a lot of thinking about that ship and why it is the way it is and what you could use it for, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want to sort of do a deep dive on that. I'm hoping to get Andy Presby on board for that as well. You may recall that I pulled some blueprints off the JBot website, and so there's lots of potential there for talking about specific ships that he's got in that site. He's got some very, very interesting blueprints there, and I've used them in the past, but it's been a little while, and I think it's worth going back and taking another look at them. I want to go through the spaceflight chronology, which is like the first thing that Rick Sternbach did that sort of said Federation. And, it was the first thing that he published where we got to know who he was. And then I also want to look at Space 1999 and UFO. I think there's some interesting things there from a ship design standpoint. And, the Eagle from Space 1999 is a classic, iconic design. And oh my God, is it wrong? And so I'd like to offer, my thoughts on what makes it iconic and my thoughts on what makes it wrong and how you could fix that, because I've got some ideas on how to fix that. One thing I've added to the list, I don't think I've had on the list previously, is the Handbook for Space Pioneers by Stephen Wolfe and Ralph, Wyzak, was the other guy's name. Something like that. Stephen Wolfe, I know, was one of the authors. And it was something that came out in like the late 1970s. And it purported to be the guidebook that they gave you when you signed up to be part of the interstellar colonization program. And it taught you all about the various worlds you could go to. And it also taught you about the starship that you would go there on. And the starship was a very, very interesting modular design that it had two interesting aspects to it. It's a modular design, and it was specifically designed so that the passenger areas got turned into high rises on the new planet. They just basically land your passenger module, and now it's a tower stuck into the pavement, stuck into the earth. And now you know the accommodations you had while going to the planet are your new home. So and it's really kind of an interesting thing, and I want to do something with that. There's a bunch of things that have a bunch of reading associated with them that I want to spend some time on, multiple episodes there. Jovian Chronicles, and I think Jovian Chronicles actually ties back into the aircraft carriers in space idea, because the Jovian Chronicles is kind of one of the models you can have. There is no FTL in that universe, and the Delta V is small enough that you're really thinking in terms of the carrier is imparting a big chunk of the Delta V on the fighter craft before the fighter craft is launched. So that's pretty interesting, I think. And then I want to do Navies and Traveler. There's a bunch of Martin Doherty stuff there. He just came out with a new book. Actually, it came out a few months ago. I just became aware of it, where he's actually trying to write doctrine. He and some other people are writing doctrine in that universe. It purports to be, the conceit is that it's a professional journal set in the universe, and I kind of like that. And then I want to do history of ship types, I'm estimating that cruisers is going to be 3 episodes. Destroyers will probably 1. Battleships will probably be maybe 2. But cruisers is probably going to be 3 episodes by itself. And then I want to talk about GDW, now Mongoose's 2300 AD series. And then there's a few things I want to do. Next time I have Pat available, I want to talk about Franz Joseph Designs. Next time I have Andy available, I want to talk about replicators and post-scarcity economics. And I also want Andy to do his Star Trek Power Systems talk. So that having been said, that's kind of where I'm aiming to go with this. I've got a notebook. I'm writing down ideas. Unfortunately, right now, starting the new job, unpacking things, like this piece of furniture right next to me was delivered about 3 o'clock this afternoon, and the one next to it, same time, and they were 95 pounds. So I had to get them from the downstairs to the upstairs, because my condo is a 2nd floor condo, but I have my own door downstairs. So I had to get it all the way up the staircase and then assemble them, and they were reasonably difficult to assemble. So, I mean, I'm at the point where I wanted to spend some time organizing the insanity behind me tonight, and I just didn't have the time to do it at all today. I want to also have Chris Carlson back on. I told you I was talking. I talked with him a little bit about some stuff that came out of the Center for Science and Budgetary Assessment, I think, CSBA, about rejiggering the loadout on Navy vessels and to add more offensive weapons and sort of shifting their doctrine with regard to how they do interceptions and using some shorter range missiles and stuff like that. There's some interesting stuff in there. And one of the reasons why it's interesting is that range is not really something that comes up in Star Trek. And it doesn't come up in a lot of science fiction, especially Star Trek's especially bad about that. It's either in range or it's not. And that's really all they care about. You don't have this thing with like sort of multiple ranges and do I want to close? Do I want to stay away, et cetera, et cetera. You don't really, like, at some point somebody should say, we don't want to get any closer to them. We want to be back farther because we outrange that guy. Because that's the sort of decision making that naval officers do all the time, or at least they did back in the age of gunfire. Nowadays, the decision making is more along the lines of which weapon do I fire? Do I have a weapon that's got a long enough range that I can shoot the archer, shoot the launching platform before it launches? And things like that have changed over time because the missiles that are being fired that potentially could be fired the range has gotten longer, and as a result of the range getting longer, now it becomes harder to shoot the launching aircraft before they launch. And so between that and the end of the Cold War, the decrease of the threat, et cetera, we really sort of adopted a policy of, okay, we're just going to shoot the incoming missiles because there isn't going to be very many of them and we can't quite get to the archer. Well, so the question is, maybe we should put a new emphasis on shooting the archer. And we had a methodology all set up to do that back in the day. It was called the outer air battle. That's why we had F-14s to go and fight the outer air battle and try to shoot as many archers as possible so that the ships doing ship self-defense had an easier time of it. We don't quite think in those terms anymore. And I think it's an interesting compare and contrast with Star Trek. But I need to finish reading some of the documents I'm doing that on, and then I'll have Chris on the show and we'll talk about that. I also think I want to have Chris on the show for when I go through, I think I told you a couple of episodes ago, I've been reading a dissertation by a historian named Ryan Peaks. And that dissertation is about the development of the designs and the doctrine for battle cruisers in the US Navy and the Royal Navy in the pre-World War I time period. And it's been a slow going dissertation. Not that it's not fascinating, not that it isn't a wonderful read, but the footnotes are fantastic. And I'm about 150 pages into the dissertation, and I've probably read 200 pages worth of footnotes because he'll cite something and I go, that sounds really interesting, and I'll go read it. And so I need to come back and take a look at all that stuff. So that's where I'm going with all of this. So people every now and then will say, like, aren't you worried about running out of topics? And it's like, no, I'm occasionally worried about running out of time because I have noticed that there's a lot of topics. There's a lot of things that are multi-session topics with a lot of prep, a lot of reading to do. They're on the list because I put them on the list because I want to talk about that stuff. But I'm very aware of the fact that I can't just, launch in the Traveler. I figure I can start after I've read about 500-page books. That will give me enough of a background that I can do the compare and contrast, and I can get into that. So, but it's going to take a little while. But thank you all for coming along on the ride on this. And there's plenty of stuff to talk about, and I have no intention to stop doing the show anytime soon. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to scroll back and take a look at what we've got here. Okay, let's see. I see that Olive said something about a friend who loves the Honorverse, which reminds me, one of the science fiction series that really does talk about range a lot is the Honorverse. David spends a lot of time talking about range there. In fact, there's a relatively major plot point that sort of changes the development of the war because the Manties have been working on ways to extend the range of their weapons. And spoiler alert, basically the first war with Haven ends because the Manties are, through the use of some new technology, are able to extend their weapons enough that basically they can take out the peeps, and the peeps can't really respond. By the time the peeps are all going to be dead by the time they get within weapons range. And so that turns out to be a big deal. which actually highlights something that we'll get back into when I get to the CSBA Brian Clark stuff. And that is strategy is largely based on timeless principles. Strategy is about enduring ideas. And strategy as a result of that, like Julius Caesar talking about strategy is talking about the same sorts of things that say Franklin Roosevelt would be talking about. Now, the details do change a lot, right? Julius Caesar wasn't worried about aircraft production. But in terms of things like understanding the enemy's center of gravity, understanding your own center of gravity, protecting yours while attacking theirs, understanding what the critical factors are, critical vulnerabilities, critical advantages that you have, doing that sort of analysis. I'm not saying that Julius Caesar didn't go to the War College. He didn't actually have necessarily a formalized process to do that stuff, but he understood that stuff. He understood how that all worked. The Romans had strategic doctrine. Like one of their pieces of strategic doctrine said that if you had to deal with something in the outskirts, you dealt with it right away, and that included reprisals. And so you don't wait around to build a big army, you launch with what you've got, because there was a shock and awe effect. And what they really wanted people to understand is that the Romans will come down upon you like a ton of bricks, and they will do it fast. They will not give you time to build up. So strategy is timeless. Tactics are not timeless. There's one or two tactical precepts that might be timeless. Attack effectively first, to put it in the Wayne Hughes method of looking at that thing. Look at that. And, the stuff from Chadwick that I've talked about, that Bob Work also talks about also, the idea about the history of the development of warfare is a history of trying to solve the targeting problem, right? And there's different ways to solve the targeting problem. But that little essay from Chadwick that I keep going back to actually sort of highlights the next point I'm going to make, which is tactics is really about the technology of the time period. Tactics changes with technology. When you go from the age of sail to steam power, your tactics change, because now you're not dependent upon the wind, and now you can move a lot faster. And there's strategic implications of that too, because now you need coal. But when push comes to shove, the tactics are heavily dependent upon what the technology is. And so it's important to sort of understand what the technology is if you're going to have a tactics conversation. And sometimes I see people who try to do the big hand little map discussion that might be totally and completely appropriate for a strategic discussion, that they ignore the details of the tactics. And I see some of that in the CSBA stuff. So I've talked with Chris about that a little bit. I think Chris would be up for coming on the show and talking with that about that. But we might have had that conversation at least in part tonight, but he was unavailable. So I want to have that conversation with him at some point. Okay, so going back through, let's see. Hello, everybody. Hello. Wright comments that sustained small steps are still steps. Yep. So every little bit counts. So like all of this stuff used to be in boxes. Those are boxes that are not there anymore. And most of those boxes have gone to the recycle place. Wright asks if I will have access to Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren with a new job. No, I will not. In fact, I probably have less access than I did before. At one point, I kind of had access there when I was at DIA, but I don't really have any access there. The new job, I am not a federal employee in the new job. And so as a result of that, I will go out and I will let show a little leg here. I am now a contractor. And so, if I don't have a reason to be there, then there's no reason for me to be there. So I don't have any contacts at Dahlgren right now that I know of. There's one or two people that used to be at Dahlgren. I think they moved on, but I should sort of track them down. Let's see. So Dustin says Starfleet's first carrier on screen is the Akira class, and I'm not sure I'd call it a carrier. And this actually, one of the things that I'm going to talk about, probably in the Akira episode, but certainly in the episode about ship types, is what exactly is a through-deck cruiser, right? What exactly is that thing that the Russians have, the Kuznetsov? We look at it and we see an aircraft carrier, but Russian doctrine describes it as a heavy aviation carrying ship or something like that. That's what the Russian translates to in English. And some people say, well, that's just because of the Montreux Convention. They want to get it out of the Black Sea through the Dardanelles. There's a restriction on aircraft carriers. And it's like, yeah, except the thing is that Russian doctrine always had their carrier as a support vessel. Not support as in like an oiler, but the carrier was there to provide additional capabilities that the surface action group lacked. It wasn't there as the thing that you built the force around. So like US carrier doctrine, when carriers first started, carriers were all about scouting. Right? Hey, it's useful to have airplanes. We can use them for scouting. That's what a carrier was for. It wasn't about launching attacks on enemy ships. And then it became about, well, we could shoot down their scouts, and we probably want to have some defense for our scouts. And so, yeah, maybe putting guns on these things probably helps. That probably helps. And as airplanes got better, there were people that said, what about bombs? Let's put bombs on it. Maybe even torpedoes. Let's do that. And, so the United States Navy does the fleet problems in the 1920s. And those early fleet problems are all about surrogate forces. They're all about, like, we're going to fly an airplane 100 miles and pretend it's 300 miles. And it's going to carry a 50-pound weapon, and we're going to pretend it's a 500-pound weapon, because they didn't really have anything that could carry a 500-pound weapon, but they knew they could do the projection. It's like, yep, engine power is going up, capabilities are going up, speed's going up, et cetera, et cetera. We will be at a point where we can carry a 500-pound weapon 300 miles, and so we should do some thinking about what are we going to do with it when we can do that. And the Russians never really, they've used them in Syria to attack land targets and stuff like that. But the Russians always considered their carrier to be a support thing. And, so that's why, to some degree, it's apples and oranges when you compare a U.S. carrier to like the Italian carrier or the Spanish carrier or some of those others, because they don't plan on using it in the same way as we do. It's not just a difference in size, although size being smaller makes it cheaper, and being smaller does limit its capability. The Italians and their small carrier, they could not use it like we use ours. But then again, that's not what they wanted. They could have bought one like ours. They didn't. They bought theirs because that's what they wanted. And so it's important to understand those things. And every now and then you see the idea of a through-deck cruiser, which is something we came up with. And the Brits at one point, I think they called the carriers they had in the Falklands at one point, they were calling them through-deck cruisers. Sometimes people call stuff through-deck cruisers because they're really trying to hide things in their budget. They're trying to make it sound like we're being frugal. We didn't buy a carrier. We bought a through-deck cruiser because that's cheaper. Doesn't it sound cheaper? It sounds cheaper. So it must be cheaper, right? It's sort of funny. There were time periods where at the same time, the Brits were de-emphasizing ships. They were calling ships frigates when they should have called them destroyers, because they were trying to make them sound smaller, while at the same time we were taking things that were destroyers and calling them cruisers because we were trying to make it sound like we had more bigger ships because we had a cruiser gap. We solved the cruiser gap by crossing out the word destroyer and writing in the word cruiser in a couple of places. And so when it comes to the Akira in particular, we see nothing in Starfleet that indicates that they are thinking about using their shuttle carrier type ships to the degree that they have any. And the Akira is really kind of the only canon one. To the degree that they have anything like that, we see nothing that indicates that they're thinking about using it like the US would use an aircraft carrier, or even how the Brits would use an aircraft carrier. They're just not seem to be thinking in those terms. But then again, get back to the standard caveat, which is it's the writer's room. They're not a bunch of military experts. They're writing, their expertise is writing compelling stories. And so they'll just make stuff up in order to write what they think is a compelling story. And I find that sometimes frustrating because they do stuff where they don't really know what they're doing, but that's okay. I will do my best to sort of make it all work. And as I've said previously, as I said in the last show, you see a lot of things that don't really seem to make sense there from a carrier standpoint, in that in the real world, if you're doing fighters, strikers of some sort, if your combat capability is in the carried craft that you as a carrier deploy, that is your combat capability, and you stay away from the battle. You send that stuff instead, because that's where the combat capability is. We don't see that in Star Trek. Every time we see small ships going in for a fight, if it's a big fleet action, right? Okay, fighting the Maquis in the Badlands, that's a different story. But if it's a big fleet action, when you see the little ships go in, the big ships are right there with them, which begs the question to me, why do the little ships exist? And I don't know. I think they don't have a good conceptualization of what they're doing with those ships. I think that's part of the problem. So, okay, so yeah, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the Akira and why I think it is a direct response to the Borg. And it is the fastest response to the Borg that they could come up with. And they may have even started off with a hull they already had, a design they already had, and said, we're going to turn this into the anti-Borg thing. I think I can make a good case for that. Okay, so let's see. Olive says, I think the Akira makes more sense if it's bigger. The Akira is a surprisingly big ship. It just looks small. It looks small because it's kind of in the same sort of shape as the NX-01, and it's kind of in the same sort of shape as the Steam Runner. And so those are much smaller ships. It is not small. It is a huge ship. It is a huge ship. What Starfleet ship was the Akira class meant to replace? I think I'll get into this more, but I think that after the Borg attack, that there is a very desperate meeting amongst high officials in Starfleet about what are we going to do about this. Every time we've encountered the Borg, they just shrug off everything we've got. And so there was a multi-part response to that, which involved researching new technologies like quantum torpedoes and this torpedo and that torpedo and other things like that. And part of the response was also building something that was very much of a pure warship. It really sort of looks like a warship, and building something that carries lots of carried craft, because there seemed to be some indication that the Borg just ignored that stuff. Now, if that stuff started being a threat, then they wouldn't ignore it. And I think you can make a good argument that those ships are really scouts, and their purpose is to extend the sensor platform. If you put some warp-capable scouts and send them out to basically send them out on a line, send them out the wall, you've now got a lot bigger sensor range. That's one of the problems, though, in Star Trek is that sensors are magic in Star Trek. They just sort of do, they can do whatever they need to do, right? Oh, yeah, we're detecting a ship at 3 light years. The captain had grape nuts for breakfast. We can tell that. And then I think the sensors are too magical, but we'll see. We'll see. So more on that to come. Stephen Ross says, ironically, the eagle is supposedly the inspiration for the runabout. I also found it interesting that they thought that the Eagle and the Rebel blockade runner looked too much alike. I don't think they look anything alike. But apparently the Star Wars people thought they looked too much alike. And so the Rebel blockade runner was the original design for the Millennium Falcon, but they decided it looked too much like the Eagle, so they needed to come up with something that was more distinctive. The claim is that it is literally the case that George Lucas was eating a hamburger, took a bite out of the hamburger, looked at the hamburger and said, "Eureka." And that's how we ended up with the Millennium Falcon shape. And then the what had been Han Solo's ship got turned into the Rebel blockade runner. I don't know. And the Eagle's a nice little runabout thing. Aside from some design issues with the Eagle, I kind of look at it and say, like, that's an awful big spacecraft to be doing some of the little runabout things that you would do. It's like, it's like if every time you needed to go from point A to point B, all you had in the motor pool was a Ford Escalade or an 18-passenger van. That's even better. The only thing you ever had in the motor pool was an 18-passenger van. You probably want some things in the motor pool that aren't 18-passenger vans, because sometimes you might, you just need to do a little bit from point A to point B, and sending the big thing with the big fuel requirements is probably not the best thing in the world. But I'll talk more about that. Did Starfleet ever buy more of the Lakota subtype of the Excelsior class? I have no idea. I don't even know if the Lakota subtype is canon. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, Dustin says, imagine if during the Dominion War, if some backwater Federation role pulled out and updated old class ships like the Ares, United, or Freedom class, or even Constitution II class ships for defense. I could see that happening in some cases. In fact, this actually gets to something that, Dustin, if you go back and you look at some of the old shows, I don't usually point people at old shows, but I spent a lot of time in some of the old shows talking about this. I think that the Starfleet has a different problem set than the United States Navy does, in that the Federation is expanding. The one thing Starfleet knows is that it's going to need more ships tomorrow than it does today. And then it's going to need more ships the day after tomorrow than it does tomorrow. And it's just going to keep going on like that. The Earth is not getting any bigger. And oceans are really bad for ships. First of all, water is a solvent. Salt water especially is a solvent. So we immerse our stuff in a solvent, and it also is constantly twisting them and battering them, et cetera, et cetera. That's one of the reasons why they're getting rid of the Ticonderoga class cruisers, is because they just don't have any hull life left. The ocean is a demolition derby, and those ships have been rode hard and put away wet, and so they're getting rid of them. I think that there's an argument to be made that Federation ships are more durable, and their environment, compared to how durable they are, is more benign than the ocean is. And as a result, you see certain classic designs hang around forever. The Excelsior class is all over Deep Space Nine, despite the fact that that ship is like 80 years old by that point. There are Mirandas that show up in Deep Space Nine. That ship is way older than that at that point. And so you see things like that. Now, okay, what's really going on here? They had those models. It's very easy to pull that model out. It's very easy for them to come up with a rationale, which usually is something along the lines of an Excelsior is perfectly good for schlepping an admiral around. Why waste a frontline ship on being the admiral's taxi when you can just use an Excelsior? And also you can use an Excelsior to keep ships supplied in the mail and personnel transfers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those old Excelsiors, they had been on the forefront. Now they're not. And they're basically used for internal courier duty in situations where having some phasers is useful, but they're not frontline ships anymore. That having been said, I think they've been dramatically upgraded over the years because Federation technology looks like it's pretty dramatically upgradable. And so I think there are some I think what you see happen is eventually you get to ships that are just so out of date that you can't really update them anymore. And so those are the ships that get pulled out, right? When it gets to, eventually the NX class gets to the point where it was easier just to build a new ship than to update the old ship because all of the systems in the old ship needed to be upgraded. And there just wasn't enough space to do it. Ships got bigger over time. The systems inside the ships got bigger over time. And you started doing things like, hey, to go faster, I need to put in a big deflector dish. And I need to have a real powerful warp generator behind that deflector to generate the warp field, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe that should all be integrated. That equipment's all bigger, et cetera, et cetera. And pretty soon you've got something where you've got like the Constitution class, where a big chunk of that secondary hull is about supporting the deflector, and it's about supporting the warp engines, right? I think, I don't believe Franz Joseph. I do not think there's a bowling alley in the secondary hull. I just don't. I think what you've got there is a lot of machinery space because you've got a big deflector complex and you've got a big warp reactor and you've got and they're piping antimatter everywhere. And that's, there's lots of safety features, et cetera, associated with that. And so I think ships like that, ships will hang around until you can't really upgrade them anymore. And then the Federation gets rid of them. And so I can also see like, okay, the ship isn't quite first line, but it's not so bad to throw it away. We can always just stick it in a parking orbit. And Federation computer systems, there's an awful lot of self-diagnostics there. There's an awful lot of ability to sort of keep track of ship status, et cetera, and report in. And, what better way to train technicians than to have them do maintenance on those ships? Now, okay, it's the technology, it's not the frontline stuff, but it'll give them some idea about that stuff. And we can always use some more techs. So I could easily see Starfleet doing something like having mothball yards at various worlds and hiring some of the locals to be techs for it, with the idea that, hey, more people that have technical training, the better. And if we need to, we can pull these people into Starfleet in support roles, if nothing else. So I think that makes a lot of sense, that those ships would be around and they could be upgunned, upgraded for self-defense purposes during a crisis like the Dominion War or something like that. Okay, let's see. Olive says, don't think that the Akira was replacing anything. It was made to carry attack craft and torpedoes and anchor anti-board task forces. Yeah, that's my assessment too. That torpedoes is a big thing. It's got a lot of torpedo tubes. And I'll get into this a little bit, but what is the one common theme that you see in all those encounters with the Borg? And that is phasers don't do shit. So what are we going to do, fellow Federation Starfleet officers? How are we going to solve this problem? Sir, We could just explode a bunch of antimatter. So I think their quick turn response was to build something with as many torpedo tubes as they could, which then in turn forces them to think about torpedo tube tactics, because torpedoes are just the sort of thing that they have as a supplementary weapon. In fact, if you go back to some of the stuff that I did, I don't know, 100 episodes ago about Harris Lanning and his essay, The Naval Battle, he talks about how you've got multiple weapon systems on, this was from the 1920s, 1930s. You've got multiple weapon systems that you have available to the fleet. And that of the two main ones are torpedoes and guns are the more effective system. And torpedoes are therefore used to supplement the guns. The thing is, over a period of time, torpedoes got better. Now, by that point, torpedoes, that was kind of like the culmination point. Torpedoes were really pretty good at that point. Earlier, you had, going back to pre-World War I, you had this situation develop where they were trying to decide, those pre-dreadnought designs had guns of a lot of different calibers, and they had some that were quick firing, et cetera. And part of that was because, it's hard to hit. And yeah, a quick firing gun isn't going to penetrate, but if you poke enough holes in the bridge and the funnels and all the other topside stuff, if you shoot at all the places that aren't well armored, you will screw up a ship bad enough and kill enough of the crew that it really won't be able to do a whole lot. And so as the gunnery got better and the ranges got better, that idea sort of fell by the wayside. But the other thing that happened there was that torpedoes got better. And it became less effective to shoot at and by better, I mean longer range, greater percentage of hits. And that longer range part especially is important, because it meant that now torpedo craft, which by this point are destroyers, or people are starting to build bigger stuff, so they're going to have better seakeeping capabilities. Those torpedo craft are going to be shooting in a longer range. And as a result of shooting at a longer range, I may not be able to hit them with my short range stuff anymore. And so people think about the move from the pre-dreadnought to the dreadnought as being this critical move, and it was. But people miss the fact that there's another piece that made that work. And that other piece that made that work is the creation of the destroyer, of taking some of that capability that was on the dreadnoughts and putting it on another ship that you could sort of send off to do its thing at a distance. That's a big deal. So just talking about the creation of the dreadnought misses the point that destroyers are just as important in the development of naval tactics. And so, what's the equivalent of that in Star Trek? Or is there an equivalent, right? And I don't mean like, okay, I'm not saying, well, it happened in the real world, so something like that has to happen in Star Trek. What I'm saying is technology changes over time. And as that technology changes over time, you expect to see the thinking about the fleet change over time. How much of that do we see in terms of technology-driven changes? We see threat-driven changes, right? We watch in the original series as the Klingon problem gets worse. And we watch in the original series as the Romulan problem gets worse. And then we get to the movies. And the sort of recurring theme in the movies, it's the subtext on the background is, there's going to be a war with the Klingons. It's only a matter of time, right? And Starfleet looks increasingly militarized during the time period of the movies. increasingly militarized. I mean, I look at the Reliant, and I don't see a ship there. I see a ship, I see a warship in a way that a Constitution has a lot of warship capabilities. But in Wrath of Khan, we really see that's a warship with those big mega phaser cannons and all the rest of it. That's a warship. And so, and then, you know, then the Romulans go away, and we get together and we sing Kumbaya with the Klingons, and things just get nice. And there you see sort of changes in. I mean, the Galaxy class is a great example. Yeah, bring the family along, no problem. And then the world turns. Then the world turns to shit again, right? The Romulans come back, the Borg comes back. You've got the Dominion, you've got the Cardassians, and the Klingons start getting uppity too. And so you add all that stuff up, and it starts looking a little darker again. So Starfleet is an organization that changes according to the times. Starfleet, in that regard, is really like the United States Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is a fascinating organization because every generation or two, call it two, the Marine Corps sits back and says, are we doing the right mission? Are we the force that the United States needs right now? And frequently they go, no. We need to be doing this other thing. They turn themselves into a force. You know, they had started off as landing parties and snipers, and they ran some cannons. And then they turned themselves into, basically, they spent some time as sort of the quick reaction force in the 1800s. And then pre-World War, in World War I, they were like guys you could go to fight the land war. So they were just another army. Pre-World War II, they turned themselves into we're the guys that go and seize the relevant maritime real estate that other people want to be able to use. So we go and get it for them, and then we give it to them so they can use it to build an airstrip, to build a naval base, whatever. I'll note the Army did a lot of that in World War II, even in the Pacific. The Army had more troops in the Pacific than the Marines did. Everybody thinks about the Marines because the Marines had way better press. So, and then the Marines got turned into a land force again, right? You had Marines in Vietnam functioning as a land force. You had Marines. They looked like they were going to do an amphibious assault in Desert Storm. They were really just there, you know, to make Saddam honor the threat. For a long time there, their amphibious capability was a way of getting to the fight, but it wasn't the fight itself. In the War on Terror, they become a land force again. And then after that, nowadays, they're looking at it going like, maybe we should go seize relevant maritime real estate. And that's kind of what they're thinking about. So Starfleet is an organization that reinvents itself also. And I think that's probably, in part, it's because I believe that they're like the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has 5 canonical missions. They talk about fisheries enforcement and buoys and navigation and search and rescue and law enforcement. And, oh, by the way, they also fight wars if they have to fight wars. And I think Starfleet is a lot like the Coast Guard in that regard, with this attribute that they get from the Marine Corps of reinventing themselves every now and then, which they can do really easily just by saying, like, we got multiple missions, and it turns out this mission right now isn't that important, so we're going to do this other mission instead. We're going to de-emphasize this and emphasize that. And then when they need to fight a war, they it's like, oh yeah, we're the Navy. We should fight the war. Okay, let's see. Okay. Looking. Olive says, like, if they made the Endor class into a carrier, how many torpedo tubes? Yes. Or the other answer to that is all of them. Why did Starfleet not make a pod for the Nebula class that can carry about 5 to 10 or even 20 Defiant class ships? The thing about the Defiant is a squishy size. You can see drawings for the Defiant that have it as anything from like a super runabout, bigger than that, but anything from relatively small to relatively large. So it's kind of unclear. The Maquis ship is the same way too. They've used the same ship to represent ships of multiple different sizes, and the Klingon bird of prey can kind of do that too. I mean, the FASA solution to that was just to have multiple sizes of it, but they're a little inconsistent in the movie about exactly how big a Klingon bird of prey is. So Wright says, "I love being here." Me too, Wright. Me too. Okay. Julius Caesar was also a pioneer of self-promotion. Yes, he was, starting with the fact that he wrote his memoir in the third person. So he didn't say, "I did this." He said, "Caesar did this." And Voyager, how did 2 Defiant class ships manage to keep up the speed with the Akira? Yeah, Starfleet ships go as fast as they need to for plot purposes. They're powered by plot, they're armored by plot, they're weaponized by plot. Yeah, Wright has a good thing. I'm going to take a guess that Starfleet probably has a fleet tactical speed all ships can keep pace with to do an engagement. Yeah, that actually makes sense. Ships very rarely run around at their top speed. Even when all the ships together have that top speed. And part of the reason for that is that if you need to like reposition somebody and everybody's moving at top speed, it's really hard for somebody to go faster in order to reposition. And there's fuel usage issues, et cetera, et cetera. So as a general rule, you don't go zooming around at top speed. And as a general rule, as a practical matter, the fleet is as fast as its slowest ship. And you probably don't want the slowest ship where they have to have the pedal to the metal the entire time either, because then they have issues. And so from that standpoint, there's probably a common tactical speed. In fact, they're probably they say set standard speed. And everybody knows what that means. Let's see. Yeah, the Russians no longer have the Kuznetsov because it had a crane fall on it in dry dock, and then there were fires, like multiple fires and this and that. And it was having all sorts of issues before that. And they finally just sort of said, enough is enough. It's not worth trying to fix this thing. So, and I can't remember exactly where it was built. It might have been built in Ukraine. In fact, I think it was built in Ukraine. So, but, they used it in Syria to conduct some bombing raids. But when push comes to shove, the Russians aren't oriented around carrier tactics. And so a carrier for them is a nice to have. A carrier is a prestige ship for them. And so they've already taken the prestige ship multiple times. They probably made the calculation that we're going to continue to have problems with this. So let's just write it off now and get it out of the news. Because if we try to fix it, we're going to have another problem and it's just going to end up in the news again. And so sometimes the right answer is to cut your losses and run. And so I think that's what they did. Yeah, Dustin says technically Galaxy class could be considered a carrier. I would argue, so when I do my talk on real world carriers, I explicitly define a carrier as a ship that is designed around the flight deck, because the flight deck and the hangar bay, because those are specific things that they have to have. in order to do the carrier thing, and they drive the design decisions. A carrier looks like a carrier because of the flight deck, and there's a whole bunch of other design decisions that come naturally off of that. So I would say that the Galaxy class just has a robust hangar capability. I wouldn't call it a carrier because it's not designed around those hangar bays. Question on Star Trek III. Krug's second in command refers to the Enterprise on the approach as a Federation battle cruiser. I always thought she was a CA, not a BC. Well, it's actually funny that you say that. Yes. One possible explanation is the writer's room. But I can tell an in-universe explanation for this, and I can borrow from the real world to tell that in-universe description of that. In the United States Navy, there are two different organizations, two different parts of the Navy decide what the class and type of a ship is. It's mostly type is what we're talking about here. Class is like an Enterprise class ship, right? Type is like heavy cruiser. So there's two organizations in the United States Navy that decide what the type of a ship is. One of them is the Office of Naval Intelligence. And for all foreign ships, the Office of Naval Intelligence has the definitional capability to do that. In fact, when I worked at DIA, I was actually part of that process because I was the chair of the subcommittee for the thing that officially, the organization that made it official. So I owned the process. But as a practical matter, the agreement was, okay, O&I, you tell me what you think it is. We'll all vote on it with the O&I people, having the more. But there's other organizations that care too, like the National Geospatial Intelligence Organization cares, NSA cares, a bunch of organizations care, right? The intelligence community writ large cares. We'll have a vote on it. We'll figure it all out. O&I gets like a bigger vote than everybody else's. And in the end, me, in my role, will sprinkle holy water on it and say, so let it be written, so let it be done. So I did that job for 3 years as a collateral duty. And so the O&I owned all of the typing for all of the navies of the world. Now, we also coordinated with our allies to make sure that we were all on the same page. But the O&I got to decide what the types were for all the navies of the world, with one exception. And that exception was the United States Navy. A different group of people in the United States Navy decided what the Navy types were. And that's why, if you look at the United States Navy will tell you that we've got like 50 attack subs, something like that. I forget what the exact number is these days. If you look at the Office of Naval Intelligence and you used their standards, you would conclude that we have 3 attack subs. And that's because the Office of Naval Intelligence standards include that an SSGN, guided missile submarine, is anything that has dedicated missile launch tubes. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically what it boils down to. If you've got dedicated missile launch tubes, you are an SSGN. The US Navy says they've got a couple of SSGNs that were converted boomers, and they've got like 100 cruise missile tubes. But they specifically say that all those Virginia class and late model LAs that have their own missile tubes, those are attack boats. But O&I would say only the 3 Seawolves that don't have those missile tubes are pure attack boats. So this could just be the fact that the Klingons have a different scheme than we do, than the Federation does. The Federation calls it a cruiser. They call it a battle cruiser. because they count the weapons and they go, yeah, it looks like a battle cruiser. You may recall that there's an episode of Next Generation where the crew like loses their memory, and Worf comes to the conclusion that they're on a battleship based upon the amount of firepower they have. Clearly a battleship. The other possibility is that maybe, you know, I don't know that we ever really hear what the new ship is after, you know, in the original series, it was a heavy cruiser. I don't remember if that's ever said on screen, but we have it from, you know, reasonably canonical sources. So maybe that's the case. Maybe it changed when they upgraded it. Maybe Starfleet went back and forth. You know, maybe they called it a battle cruiser at one point, and then they went, nah, it's something else. It's a heavy cruiser, an exploration cruiser, something like that. We've done that before, right? For a while there, we were going to build the Ticonderoga class guided missile destroyer. And then because we needed more cruisers, we said, you know what? We're going to cross out the word destroyer. We're going to write in the word cruiser. Now it's a Ticonderoga class guided missile cruiser. Nothing changed about the design. We just decided to call it a cruiser. And back in 1975, we reclassified, retyped a bunch of the US Navy. For a while there, frigates were a ship that was bigger than a destroyer and smaller than a cruiser. And then we decided that frigates were going to be smaller than a destroyer. And the things that had been frigates, if they were big, they became cruisers. If they were smaller, they became destroyers. And the patrol combatant, I think, is what they called it. They said, we'll sprinkle holy water in it, and it's now a frigate. And that brought us in line with the rest of the world. That's why when you go back and you look at FASA's Star Trek game, frigates are bigger. In fact, I think frigates are actually bigger than cruisers in that game. They do something else where frigates have an assault role. Frigates carry Marines. They're assault transports. When the US Navy uses the word assault, they specifically are talking about putting Marines someplace. Assault implies that you have the capability to launch ground operations from the ship of some sort, right? You're going to attack a target on land with dudes. If you're just going to attack a target on land with missiles, the word is strike. So every now and then you'd hear talk about a strike cruiser, which in US Navy terms means a lot of land attack missiles. Strike cruiser is also a term that gets used in Star Trek terms. Somebody did a book, a fan-produced book for the FASA board game. I should talk about it at some point just because it is such a problematic book, where in every different major type, there's like literally 10 subtypes. And the problem is nobody does that. Nobody does that. Nobody has that many, not different classes, different subtypes. So you've got like a patrol frigate versus an assault frigate versus a strike frigate versus a deep penetration frigate versus a battle frigate. It's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy. And they also, I do not believe it is the case that my science fiction needs to automatically adopt current naval practices or historical naval practices. But they've got some funny definitions of like assault and things like that. And it's just like, and like their definition of strike, I think was strike is designed, what the word strike in their world means that it's designed to fight a single combatant and just really go at a single combatant. And it doesn't have a whole lot of, it's not designed to be part of a fleet action. It's designed to fight a one-on-one with a single combatant. It's like, why would you design a ship like that? I mean, you might end up with a ship that was kind of de facto like that, but why would you decide that I need a separate category for something that is that narrow of focus. I don't get it. I don't get it. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, Stephen Ross points out that the Russian carrier needs to be towed everywhere, so it's not particularly good at scouting. Let's see. So there's a bit of a discussion here about what exactly is the Galaxy class. I think that they created a class called Explorer. And so I think Explorer is something that sort of trumps everything else. Explorer means that it's got a lot of endurance. It's got a certain amount of weapons fit because you don't know what you're going to find out there. But Explorers are ships that have a lot of endurance, and they're intended for long missions. So they're fast because they've got a lot of ground to cover, and they're intended for really long missions. And that is the thing they kind of build around. And so I think you can make the argument that if you're going to, and it's like an exploration cruiser, I think might be what they call it. But I think you can make the argument that if you're using a modifier like explorer or exploration attached to another thing, if you've got an adjective like that, the adjective is about the design. Now, I've talked previously, some people design ships or define types based upon size. Some people define types based upon mission. ONI calls, there's a particular ship that the Chinese call a destroyer. We call it a cruiser because it's so big. In the Honor Harrington series, you end up with this interesting thing where the Manticorans end up building a destroyer that's twice as big as any of the People's Republic of Haven destroyers, and that's because the Manties define type by mission. The People's Republic of Haven defines type by size. And so the peeps look at it and say, that's not a destroyer, that's a small cruiser. The Manties look at it and say, it's a destroyer because it's doing a destroyer mission, what we've defined as being a destroyer mission, which is that tension is very interesting. I may have to go back and do another naming and typing episode. Why did Starfleet not build like 10 Vengeance class ships for the Dominion War? I believe the Vengeance class was the thing from the second Jar Jar Abrams movie, right? And I think the answer to that is because it's a dumb idea, because it's Jar Jar Abrams. That's my take on it. Kira has a bunch of different sizes. There's a bunch of different sources that, and there's also some sources that you would think that would be canonical, like the model builders, because they've got like semi-official write-ups and stuff like that. They clearly undercount the photon torpedo tubes. There's some sources that say that Akira has like 4 photon torpedo tubes. The real answer is more like 25. If you look at things and you go like, well, if that's a photon torpedo tube, then that exact same greeble is here and here and here and here and here. Okay. Yeah, Olive says, if you think about it, what happens in Borg engagements is you get 1 or 2 hits before they adapt. So how about 24 torpedoes? And so that's part of what my thinking is. You want to be able to fire a big spread. The other part of my thinking is they adapt by doing funky shield harmonics things, right? They can sort of, phasers have a frequency, shields have a frequency. They can make them better, more effective, less effective, et cetera, et cetera. But, exploding antimatter just goes boom. There's no frequency with the big boom of the exploding antimatter. So like, okay, these guys own our number on phasers. they can just basically neutralize our phasers anytime we want. Let's see them neutralize the big boom. And like I said, I think this is the first approximation that they had. They said, okay, we got to do something. And it reminds me a lot about things that happened back in the 1950s with airplanes. We build airplanes thinking that we'd build like 500 airplanes, keep them for 5 years, and then get rid of them. Give them to the Guard. They'd use them for training, et cetera, et cetera. F-104 Starfighter wasn't around very long. B-58 Hustler wasn't around very long. Now, in the case of the B-58, things like that are sort of interesting. The B-52 was considered a stopgap. We're going to build the B-52, but it's going to be replaced by the B-58, and then it's going to be replaced by the B-70, and then it's going to be replaced by the B-1, and it didn't get replaced by any of those. And part of that was it was a really overbuilt truck. And at some point we realized, you know what we need? We need a really overbuilt truck. The overbuilt part means it's still got a lot of life in those wings, because metal fatigue comes for us all. But if you used 3 times as much metal as you would need if you were trying to skimp on it, then you can make it last for a while. And so, and the other thing that's kept it in the fleet is that there's so damn many of them that that they can pull parts off of old ones if they need to. And the other thing that kept them in the fleet is because there's so damn many of them. And I talked about this when I talked about the Ambassador class in one of the episodes. So why don't we see very many Ambassador class? Why don't we see lots of derivatives from that? Well, the real answer was, they had Miranda models just laying around. They had Excelsior models just laying around. They had to create an Ambassador class specifically for yesterday's Enterprise. And so before that, they didn't have them laying around. And so they just didn't. I would argue, though, you can make the in-universe answer that the reason why they did it that way is because they just didn't build very many of them. They built a shit ton of Excelsiors and a shit ton of Mirandas. And you can either keep the Excelsior and the Ambassador, or you can keep just the Excelsior. And so we did the same thing with KC-135s. We kept the KC-135s and we got rid of the KC-10s, because if we kept the KC-10s, we were still going to have to keep a bunch of KC-135s, and that does not solve the problem of we've got 2 airplanes in the fleet. So if you build a lot of something and you build your force around that thing, then you have to replace all of it. So now the other answer might be that it might be that if you go off on the other Federation border, right, the one that doesn't face the Cardassians and the places where the Enterprise are, the places where we live. If you go out on it might be that there's some other place where they got ambassadors coming out the wazoo, because they just basically said, for logistics purposes, put them all together. Like they home ported all 3 of the Seawolf class submarines in the same home port, because it just makes it easier to have them all be in the same home port. So, okay, let's see. Why are the Kelvin and New Trek ships at least 25% larger? Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? If you like that, that's great. I don't pay any attention to it. I don't consider it canon. I don't try to figure out what they're up to. Okay, and I'm going down here. Yeah, there's a comment about the USS Enterprise, the CVN-65 aircraft carrier. They tried to retire her for years, and every time they tried to retire her, somebody went, okay, the bill for decommissioning is going to be this number, and they'd hand it to whoever was making the decision, and they'd go, oh my God, let's just send her into the yard and revamp her. And so as a result of that, She would frequently go into the yard for a 6-month overhaul and be in the yard for like 18 months. That happened multiple times toward the end of her life. In fact, I did an exercise one time where Building 65 USS Enterprise was in like month 12 of the 6-month overhaul. And as a result, she could not get to sea. So the command staff is doing the exercise from the shipyard, and we're all at sea without her. So that was kind of fun, actually. Yeah, right. Says, I see the Miranda class as a C-130 of Starfleet. Right there with you. Yeah, Olive, I agree with you with regard to Skydance. Yeah, so the only retrofitted TOS Constitution was NCC 1701, easier to build new Constitution 2s versus rebuilding old ones. I totally and completely agree. The reason why they did that in the movie, they were going to give them a new ship, and they went, the producers went, or the studio went, you can't give them a new ship. It's the Enterprise. You can't give them a new ship. And so they had them do this fiction of doing the rebuild. And there's some people that have sort of taken that and ported it into the universe, that they tried to decommission the Enterprise, and the Federation citizens said, no, you can't. And so they did the rebuild. There's another version of that says that they got into the project and sort of went like, okay, we did it once. Now we know how hard it is. We're not doing that again. So now you could also make the argument that maybe there was something else going on there that we just don't know about. Like, for instance, maybe Enterprise already had some upgrades that they thought made it useful to sort of make changes in Enterprise. I don't know. Could be. Right? If the technology has changed over time, I can't remember where she was in the build schedule for the original Constitution class ships, but maybe at some point she'd had an upgrade. And so the part of it was they said, yeah, well, we spent a bunch of money on her. We upgraded her. She's got this added capability. Let's start with her. I think all of these are I can't come up with a good in-universe explanation for doing something as radical as what they did, and calling it the same ship. In the real world, there was one point where we upgraded a couple of ships, where we upgraded the ship by detaching the ship's wheel, throwing the ship away, building a new ship, and reattaching the ship's wheel. And I mean, it literally was like that bad. And it was because there was some law that said that you couldn't build new ships. And so it was the Navy's way of getting around that. They didn't totally pull one over on Congress. I think what was going on was Congress said, all right, we'll let you have the new ships, but if you do it this way, it doesn't set a precedent, right? We don't have to overturn the law. I think that's what was really going on there. Not my time period, though. Stephen Ross says that last torpedo hit us in the Ferris wheel. Yeah, I don't understand why you'd put all that stuff there. Like a bowling alley, really? An arboretum? Okay, yeah, I got it. They're going to be away for a long period of time, but even so, it's like, I don't see, yeah. Yeah, on screen, phasers seem to be a Federation thing. Almost everyone uses disruptors. Phaser for Fed makes sense as the development of a utility tool first, weapon second. Apparently, that's a Starfleet Battles reference. Yeah, there's a couple of different thoughts on exactly what a disruptor is. I actually like the one that I think is not. I think there's a canon answer that gets into some technical details, or close to canon answer. I like the idea that the difference between a Federation and between a phaser and a disruptor is a disruptor is a phaser with only one setting, whereas the Federation is willing to put up with like some complication and some power loss by having multiple settings, whereas a disruptor is just like, we only optimized on one variable. So, but that's my headcanon. Okay. I am skipping a few things here and there because I look at the clock and it's already, we're at the hour and 20-minute mark. All said, I lost my Latin copy of De Bello Gallico in a move, but damn that guy. Yeah, yeah. Did I like the Cerritos class? Now, so first of all, I will admit that I haven't really watched Lower Decks. Second, if I remember correctly, though, the Cerritos class has the same problem that the Oberg class has, where you've got this structure that's only connected via the engines, and you look at that and you go, how do you get there? I don't like that. As a general rule, I don't like that. As a general rule, I don't like ships where I look at it and I can't say, okay, this is where the warp reactor is. Here's how it gets warp plasma to the engines. Here's how it gets warp plasma to the deflector. And here's where the deflector is. And from what I remember from the Cerritos, and here's how the people get to their workstations there. And there's a lot of Starfleet ships that are designed based totally on the rule of cool, and they don't really have any basis in like engineering. The point is that Dustin says in yesterday's Enterprise, the Enterprise was classified as a battleship. That's not the same ship. That's a much different ship. Yeah, TJ points out 1975 redesignation scheme. He must have said that before I went on to talk about it. What is Skydance doing with Starfleet battles in FOSSA? Nothing. I mean, Starfleet battles, from what I understand, their contract is pretty ironclad, and they had a contract that had no expiration date. FOSSA, FOSSA lost the license eons ago. So yeah, there's no new stuff coming out of the FOSSAs. Maybe the Klingons called it a battle cruiser because it looks more impressive in the after action report. Could that actually happen? Could something like that happen? I don't know. That seems a little far-fetched to me, he says sarcastically. Yeah, Galaxy class was designed to fly on a 20-year mission per Sternbach, but none of them got to do that. I think the idea was 20 years between major upgrades. So, the Galaxy class had pretty good size. I could see being born on the Galaxy class and graduating from high school on the Galaxy class and being there the entire time. Okay, scrolling through. So Wright says DC-3, B-52, and C-130 will still be flying after we die. True for the B-52. not sure about the C-130 actually, because the C-130 is still in production. I'm not sure what the oldest C-130 is. There's some I'm sure that have been around forever, but the thing is, C-130s are still in production and they're still revving the model number. DC-3s, of course, are way out of production, and I don't know how many of them are around. Dustin argues that the Ambassador class was a failed type of ship, giving the mixture of the old school duotronic computers and not ready for isolinears. We see Excelsiors and we see Mirandas, and that makes me think that maybe the Ambassadors, if those ships are probably upgraded to some degree, and I would think that if you're going to keep, just in terms of the technology, if you're going to keep those other ships, you'd keep the Ambassadors. I do think, though, there might be a logistics argument as to why you wouldn't if you didn't build that many Ambassadors. And it's like, we can either keep both ships or we can only keep one. I can see why they might not get rid of the Ambassador, might have gotten rid of the Ambassadors. We also don't know how many there were. So it might be that there was only a handful to begin with. Okay. All right. I'm getting close to getting caught up. Yeah, I need to look at lower decks and take a look at the Cerritos. I just really haven't. Olive points out, I think Cerritos was the rule of uncool, though, kind of the point. Yep. FASA does exist, actually. They at least exist as a company that holds licenses, and they're actually doing a couple of new games. They're doing Kickstarters for reboots of the Renegade Legion series, although nothing like the old Renegade Legion. It is a game with somewhat similar mechanics and a totally different background. And so I bought Renegade Legion Interceptor, and I regret doing so, because I thought I was getting a new version of an old beloved property, and I wasn't. I was getting something new. And if I had realized, if I had had a chance to look at the new, I guess I did, but I was too busy going, oh my God, Renegade Legion, yes, yes, yes. If I had actually looked through the stuff and realized what I was getting, I wouldn't have bought it. So, but they apparently still exist. You can do a search and find them. Newer C-130s are getting jet engines. They've had turboprops forever, which is sort of a jet engine. I've never heard about a C-130 with a jet engine. I will go look for that. I would be surprised. And that brings us to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and call it here. Lissa, do you want to jump on real quick? If you're, I just saw you say something, Lissa, but you're not on. I think Lissa is having a conversation with somebody else off screen. I can see her, but you guys can't. So with that in mind, as always, I am absolutely and completely humbled by the fact that that y'all are willing to come and spend your Saturday night listening to me talk about stuff. And so I really, really appreciate that fact. And I look forward to doing this again next week. And so with that in mind, have a good weekend. Have a good Sunday. Talk to you later.